The plantation owner had always believed that power was something you passed down the same way you passed down land, livestock, or a name carved into courthouse records. On the morning he decided to make the gift, the air was heavy with late summer heat, the kind that clung to skin and slowed every movement, as if the world itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. His son stood beside him on the wide veranda, young but already carrying the posture of someone raised to command. The boy had been educated in the language of ownership since childhood, taught that some lives existed to serve others, that the rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon were proof of order rather than cruelty. The father watched him carefully, not with affection so much as assessment, measuring whether the lessons had taken root. The gift was presented without ceremony because in the father's mind it required none. 5 enslaved women were brought forward, lined up in the yard below as if they were part of an inventory being transferred. Each had been selected deliberately, not for their humanity, but for qualities the owner believed would make them valuable: strength, youth, obedience as he defined it, and a quietness he mistook for acceptance. He spoke of them the way a man might speak of horses or tools, explaining their usefulness, their history on the plantation, their supposed temperaments. To him this was a practical lesson for his son, a demonstration of what it meant to inherit authority. He believed generosity was measured by the scale of control one could bestow. The son listened, nodding, his eyes flicking between his father and the women below. He had grown up surrounded by enslaved people, yet this moment felt different. This was not the distant power of watching orders carried out by others. This was ownership placed directly into his hands. The father mistook the boy's silence for gratitude, even pride. He did not notice the subtle tension in his son's jaw, the way his fingers curled and uncurled as if he were bracing himself. In the owner's mind, this gift would secure his legacy. It would ensure that his son understood the system not as something abstract, but as something personal and permanent. The women stood motionless, though each was acutely aware of every sound, every glance. They had been told little, only that they were to be moved, transferred like goods from one ledger to another. Fear sat heavy in their chests, but it was a practiced fear, one learned over years of surviving under watchful eyes. Each of them understood that moments like this often marked the beginning of something worse. They knew the son by reputation, had seen him from a distance as he grew into manhood, had heard whispers about his temper, his indulgences, his attempts to imitate his father's authority. None of them had been given the luxury of hope, but all of them held tightly to the instinct to endure. The plantation owner spoke at length about responsibility, about how managing people required firmness, how kindness was a weakness that invited disorder. He framed cruelty as necessity and control as care, repeating the same phrases that had been spoken to him by his own father decades earlier. In his telling, the system was natural, even benevolent. He never once acknowledged the violence that sustained it, the chains both visible and invisible that kept the plantation running. To him, the gift was proof of his success as a patriarch. To the women, it was a reminder that their lives could be rearranged with a single sentence. As the exchange concluded, the owner gestured dismissively, signaling that the women were now under his son's authority. It was done as casually as one might hand over a set of keys. The son descended the steps, his boots crunching against the gravel, stopping a few feet away from them. For a brief moment no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The women kept their eyes lowered, not out of submission but out of survival, aware that a wrong look could be interpreted as defiance. The son studied them, not with the confident gaze of someone certain of his role, but with something more complicated, something unsettled. The father watched from above, satisfied. He believed this pause was simply his son adjusting to the weight of command. He did not realize that the gift he had given carried with it a moral burden his son had never fully confronted. The son had seen cruelty on the plantation before, had benefited from it without question, but this moment forced him to acknowledge it in a more intimate way. These were not faceless laborers in a distant field. They were 5 individuals whose lives were now explicitly tied to his decisions. The realization unsettled him, though he did not yet understand why. For the women, that pause was terrifying. Silence often preceded violence. Yet within that shared stillness something else flickered, a brief awareness of one another's presence, a silent recognition that they were not alone in this moment. Though they had not spoken, though they came from different quarters and different histories, they understood that their fate had been bound together by an act they had no control over. The gift had made them a group, whether they wished it or not. The plantation owner eventually broke the silence, reminding his son of schedules, duties, and expectations. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had never been forced to question the foundations of his world. He spoke of discipline and order, warning against leniency. The son nodded again, but his attention drifted back to the women, to the way they stood so still it was almost defiant, to the quiet strength it must take to endure such moments over and over again. He felt something he had no language for, a discomfort he had been taught to suppress. As the women were led away to their new quarters, the father felt content. In his mind, the day marked a successful transition of power, a reinforcement of tradition. He retired indoors, already thinking of other matters, confident that the system he had upheld all his life would continue unchanged through his son. He did not consider that, by making the gift so openly, so deliberately, he had created a moment that could not be undone. A moment that forced everyone involved to confront the truth of what ownership really meant. The women walked together, escorted by overseers who treated the transfer as routine. Yet beneath their measured steps, something shifted. They did not know what the future held, but they understood that the old patterns had been disrupted. A new master meant new dangers, but also unknown variables. They began, quietly and cautiously, to observe not just the son, but one another, sensing that survival might depend on unity as much as obedience. This understanding was not spoken aloud, but it lived in the spaces between them, in exchanged glances and shared silences. That day the plantation looked no different to an outsider. The fields stretched on, the house stood tall, and the routines continued as they always had. But beneath the surface, something had been set in motion. The gift, intende. D, as a symbol of unquestioned authority, had instead planted the seeds of tension and consequence. The father believed he had strengthened his legacy, unaware that he had also exposed its fragility. What he saw as a simple act of inheritance would soon reveal the limits of power and the dangerous unpredictability of human will in ways he could never have imagined. Life inside the house revealed itself slowly, not all at once, as though the walls themselves chose when to expose their truths. The 5 women were moved from their previous quarters to rooms closer to the main residence, spaces that were cleaner and quieter, but no less confining. The change was presented as an improvement, a sign of favor, yet every step closer to the house came with heavier scrutiny. Servants' bells rang at all hours, summoning them without warning, reminding them that their time no longer belonged to the rhythms of the fields, but to the unpredictable demands of a single household. The floors they walked were polished, the furniture carefully arranged, but the beauty of the surroundings only sharpened the sense of captivity. Comfort did not soften the reality that every movement was observed, every mistake noted. Each woman learned quickly that survival here depended on attention to detail. A cup placed slightly off-center, a door closed too loudly, a glance held for a moment too long. Small things carried consequences. The son, still learning how to wear authority, drifted in and out of their days, sometimes distant, sometimes suddenly present, his mood shifting in ways that kept everyone uneasy. Overseers and house staff enforced rules with practiced efficiency, reinforcing the idea that discipline was not personal, only procedural. Yet the women understood that procedure could be just as cruel as anger, perhaps more so, because it left no room for appeal. They rarely spoke openly, during the day. Words were dangerous, easily twisted or overheard. Instead, communication happened through gestures and timing, through knowing when to step aside and when to stand firm. At night, when the house settled and the sounds of insects crept in through open windows, they began to share the same small space, sleeping within earshot of one another. In the dark, whispers replaced silence. At first, they spoke only of practical things: who watched which hallway, how long it took for the lamps to be extinguished, where the floorboards creaked. These conversations were cautious, fragmented, shaped by years of learning that trust could be punished. Gradually, those whispers stretched into something deeper. One woman spoke of a mother left behind on another plantation, another of a child sold years earlier, her name still carried like a bruise. Each story was offered tentatively, as if it might be taken back if met with the wrong response. But instead of judgment, there was recognition. Pain did not need explanation, it only needed space. In those moments, the walls seemed to recede slightly, as though the act of sharing reclaimed a small piece of what had been taken from them. Days followed a strict order, yet within that order, patterns emerged that the women learned to read. The son's presence was unpredictable, but his habits were not entirely random. There were hours when the house belonged to the women more than to anyone else, brief windows where supervision loosened and tasks overlapped. During these times, they exchanged glances that carried meaning, confirming small observations, building a quiet map of the household's weaknesses. No one spoke of escape or defiance, not yet, but awareness itself became a form of resistance. To understand the system was to recognize that it was not as seamless as it pretended to be. The house staff, some enslaved, some hired, played their own roles in this fragile ecosystem. A cook lingered a second longer than necessary, passing along a bit of information disguised as complaint. A stable hand avoided certain corridors at night, unintentionally revealing which paths were safest. These were not acts of heroism, just human impulses to connect, to ease another's burden when possible. The women absorbed these details carefully, storing them away without comment. Knowledge, they knew, was something that had to be carried quietly. Emotionally, the strain was constant. Fear never left them, but it changed shape. It was no longer the raw terror of the fields, where violence was visible and immediate. Here, fear was subtler, threaded through politeness and routine. It lived in the uncertainty of expectation, in the sense that the rules could shift without warning. Yet alongside that fear, something unexpected took root. Living so closely together, sharing both labor and silence, the women began to sense strength in their collective presence. Alone, each of them was vulnerable. Together, they were harder to ignore, harder to break. The son noticed the change, though he could not have named it. He observed how efficiently the household ran, how the women anticipated needs before they were spoken. To him, this efficiency looked like obedience perfected. What he failed to see was the quiet communication behind it, the way cooperation allowed the women to shield one another, to subtly redirect attention when one of them faltered. Their unity was not loud or obvious, it was woven into the fabric of daily life, disguised as competence. Nights became the women's only true refuge. When the lamps were low and the house finally slept, they allowed themselves moments of honesty. Laughter, soft and careful, sometimes slipped through, surprising them all. It felt dangerous, almost forbidden, to experience nothing resembling lightness. But those moments mattered. They reminded each other that they were still capable of feeling something beyond fear. They spoke of memories not just of loss, but of joy. Songs half remembered, festivals from childhood, the sound of water running free. These recollections were acts of defiance, reclaiming pieces of identity the system tried relentlessly to erase. Still, the pressure of the house never fully lifted. Every morning brought a return to watchfulness, to measured movements and guarded expressions. The women understood that their closeness could be seen as a threat if it became too visible. They learned when to separate, when to appear distant, performing the isolation expected of them. This performance was exhausting, but it was also strategic. By giving the appearance of compliance, they protected the fragile bonds forming beneath the surface. Over time, the house itself seemed to respond to their presence. The rigid atmosphere softened in places, not because authority loosened, but because the women learned how to move within it. They became attuned to the emotional weather of the household, sensing when tension was rising and when it was safe to breathe a little easier. This awareness did not grant freedom, but it granted a measure of control, however limited. In a world designed to strip them of agency, even that small measure felt significant. What none of them could yet articulate was that this life inside the house, with all its constraints, had done something unintended. By placing them together, by forcing their days and nights into close alignment, the system had created the conditions for connection. The plantation depended on isolation to maintain power, on keeping people divided and silent. Inside the house, that isolation had begun to crack. The women did not yet know what that meant for the future, only that something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly. To an outsider, the household appeared orderly, even harmonious. Tasks were completed, rules followed, the hierarchy intact. But beneath that surface, the 5 women carried a shared understanding that life here was not just something to be endured, it was something to be observed, measured, and when the moment came, challenged in whatever ways they could manage. The gilded cage remained a cage, but within it, resolve was taking shape, steady and patient, waiting for a reason to reveal itself. The bond between the 5 women did not announce itself with a single moment of clarity. It grew the way roots grow underground, unseen but persistent, pushing slowly through whatever resistance lay in their path. At first, it was simply necessity. Living so close together meant their lives overlapped in ways they could not avoid. They woke to the same bells, moved through the same corridors, and returned at night to the same tight spaces where the air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Over time, that shared routine created familiarity, and familiarity softened into something more deliberate. They began to notice one another, not just as fellow sufferers, but as individuals whose presence mattered. Trust was the hardest thing to build. Each of them carried memories of betrayal, of words repeated to the wrong ears, of kindness punished because it was mistaken for weakness. So they learned to test one another carefully. A warning whispered just in time. A task quietly taken over when someone's hands were shaking too much to continue, a watchful pause in conversation when footsteps approached. These were the small offerings through which trust was measured. When those gestures were returned rather than exploited, something settled between them, a sense that they were safer together than apart. As weeks passed, their whispered conversa grew longer and more honest. They began to speak not only of what had been done to them, but of who they had been before. One remembered working beside her father as a child, learning the names of plants and how to read the weather by the sky. Another spoke of a sister whose laugh she could still hear if she closed her eyes. These stories were not shared lightly. Each one was an act of vulnerability, a reminder of a self that the world around them insisted no longer existed. Yet in telling them, the women felt those selves stir again, fragile but alive. They learned one another's fears as well. One woman startled at sudden noises, another grew silent when voices were raised, a third struggled to sleep unless someone else was awake nearby. Instead of judging these reactions, they adapted around them, adjusting routines, offering quiet reassurances. Care took many forms, some as simple as sitting close in the dark, close enough to feel another person breathing. These moments did not erase the pain they carried, but they made it more bearable. Gradually, their bond shifted from comfort to intention. Without ever naming it, they began to think collectively. Observations were shared and compared, patterns discussed in fragments that only made sense when assembled together. They spoke of the son's habits, of the times he was most distracted and the times he watched too closely. They noted which overseers were cruel and which were merely careless. This was not idle talk. It was a quiet education, a way of understanding the forces that shaped their days so they might better anticipate them. There were moments of disagreement, of course. Survival had taught each of them different lessons, and those lessons sometimes collided. One urged caution, another believed caution had already cost them too much. Voices were kept low, but emotions ran high, frustrations spilling tea in brief flashes before being pulled back into control. Yet even in conflict, there was a difference now. No one walked away entirely. They returned to the conversation, again and again, because the bond between them had begun to feel necessary, not optional. The house itself became part of their shared language. They learned where shadows fell at different hours, where conversations echoed and where they disappeared into thick walls. One woman discovered a narrow space behind a storage room where sounds seemed to vanish. Another noticed that a particular corridor was avoided by most of the staff after nightfall. These details were passed along quietly, woven into their collective understanding of the place. The house was no longer just a site of confinement. It was a structure that could be read, understood, even subtly navigated. Emotionally, something profound was happening. For the first time in years, perhaps in their lives, the women were being seen by one another without judgment or ownership. They were not being valued for their labor or their obedience, but for their presence, their thoughts, their endurance. This recognition carried weight. It reminded them that their worth had never truly belonged to those who claimed to own them. That realization was dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it could not be easily unlearned. They began to protect one another in ways that went beyond comfort. When one was called away unexpectedly, the others watched more closely, ready to intervene if something seemed wrong. If one returned shaken, the rest adjusted their tasks to give her space to recover. These acts were subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking for them, but they were deliberate. The women were learning how to be a unit, how to respond as one without drawing attention. At night, their conversation sometimes drifted toward the future, or never in clear terms. They did not speak of escape or rebellion outright. The risks were too great, the consequences too severe. Instead, they spoke in hypotheticals, in questions that floated without answers. What did freedom feel like, really? Was it a place or a state of mind? Could it exist in small pieces, claimed quietly, even under watchful eyes? These discussions were not plans, but they planted seeds, ideas that lingered long after the words had faded. The son remained largely unaware of what was unfolding. He saw efficiency, quiet cooperation, a household that ran smoothly under his authority. What he could not see was the emotional labor beneath that surface, the constant calculation and mutual support that made such smoothness possible. In his mind, control was working as intended. In reality, control was being studied, its edges tested gently, patiently. There were moments when the bond was strained by fear. A sudden punishment elsewhere on the plantation would ripple through them, reminding everyone how fragile their safety was. In those moments, the instinct to retreat inward resurfaced, to protect oneself at the expense of others. Yet each time something pulled them back together. Perhaps it was the memory of shared nights, or the knowledge that isolation had never truly saved anyone. Whatever the reason, they chose again and again connection over withdrawal. The bond they were forming did not make them fearless. Fear remained a constant companion, but it did change the way they carried it. Fear was no longer something endured alone in the dark. It was something acknowledged, shared, and therefore slightly less powerful. In recognizing one another's fear, they also recognized their own courage, even if they never named it as such. Over time, the women began to sense that their unity itself was a form of resistance. The system depended on fragmentation, on keeping people too divided to imagine alternatives. By building trust, by thinking together, they were quietly undermining that foundation. This was not rebellion in the dramatic sense, but it was no less significant. It was a reclaiming of agency, however limited, a refusal to be reduced entirely to what the system demanded. The bond did not promise safety or success. It did not erase the dangers that surrounded them. What it offered was something subtler and perhaps more powerful, the knowledge that they were not alone, that their lives were intertwined in ways that gave them strength. Whatever lay ahead, whether it brought opportunity or catastrophe, they would face it together. And in a world designed to strip them of choice, that decision, made quietly and without permission, was a profound act of defiance. The moment did not arrive with thunder or raised voices. It came quietly, almost gently, on a night that looked like every other night from the outside. The house settled into its familiar stillness, lamps dimmed, doors closed, the air thick with heat and the distant sound of insects. Nothing about the evening suggested that the order of things was about to be disturbed. That was the nature of what they did next. It relied on the assumption that no one expected anything to change. For days beforehand, the women had spoken less than usual, not because the bond between them had weakened, but because it had tightened. They had reached a point where words felt unnecessary, even risky. Meaning passed between them through glances and pauses, through the way one lingered an extra moment in a doorway or adjusted a task so another could move freely. Each of them understood that what they were about to do could not be undone. There would be no explanation afterward that made it safe, no apology that softened the consequences. Still, none of them suggest. Ed turning back. The decision itself had not been dramatic. There was no single vote, no speech made in the dark. It had formed slowly, shaped by shared exhaustion and a growing refusal to accept the limits placed on them. They had talked around it for nights, circling the idea without naming it, until finally it was no longer an idea but an understanding. What they planned was not escape, not violence, not anything that fit the familiar stories whispered about rebellion. It was something subtler and in its own way more destabilizing. That night, when the last footsteps faded and the house seemed to exhale, they moved. Not all at once, not hurriedly. Each woman followed a path she had memorized, timing her steps to the rhythms of the house. One paused near a window where moonlight spilled across the floor, listening for any sign of wakefulness. Another slipped through a corridor that was usually avoided, knowing it would be empty now. They met not in the open, but in a narrow space behind a storage room, the place where sound seemed to vanish. There, they stood close enough to feel one another's presence without touching. For a brief moment, doubt flickered. Not fear exactly, but the weight of what came next. Each of them understood what obedience had cost them over the years, how much of themselves had been worn away by compliance. This act was not driven by hope of reward, it was driven by the refusal to lose anything more. One of them nodded, almost imperceptibly. That was all it took. They did not raise their voices. They did not run. Instead, they did the one thing the system could not tolerate. They acted together, openly and deliberately, where they were expected to be isolated and silent. They entered a part of the house where they were never meant to gather, where their presence alone violated unspoken rules. They sat side by side in full view of the space that symbolized authority waiting. When the son entered, drawn by a sound he could not quite identify as wrong, he stopped short. The sight unsettled him in a way he was not prepared for. 5 women, seated calmly, looking at him without lowered eyes or hurried movements. There was no defiance in their posture, no aggression. What shook him was their stillness, the quiet certainty with which they occupied the room. It was as if they had stepped outside the roles he understood, refusing to perform them any longer. He spoke first, his voice sharper than he intended. He asked what they were doing, why they were there. The question assumed an answer that fit within the rules he knew. None of them responded immediately. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. When one of the women finally spoke, her voice was steady, unraised, carrying no apology. She said only that they wished to be heard. Not as property, not as servants fulfilling a task, but as people. The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had been prepared for pleading, perhaps even anger. He was not prepared for this calm insistence. Another woman spoke, then another, each adding a piece, not overlapping, not interrupting. They did not recount every cruelty they had endured. They did not need to. They spoke of boundaries, of what they would no longer accept, of the conditions under which they would continue to work. It was not a negotiation in the way he understood negotiations. It was a declaration. What made it truly shocking was not the content of their words, but the way they were delivered. There was no single spokesperson, no leader to isolate and punish. Each woman spoke, briefly and clearly, reinforcing the others. Their unity transformed simple statements into something formidable. To confront one would have meant confronting all of them. His system had taught him that authority flowed downward, that control depended on fragmentation. In that moment he saw the flaw in that belief. His first instinct was anger, a reflex learned from years of watching power enforced. But anger required an outlet, someone to direct it at, and the women gave him none. They did not provoke him, they did not flinch. The calm in the room made his own reactions feel loud and uncertain. He realized with a suddenness that unsettled him that any punishment he chose would not restore the order he expected. It would only expose how fragile that order truly was. The house seemed different then, as if the walls were listening. The son felt the weight of his father's teachings pressing against this unexpected reality. He had been told that control was natural, that it needed no justification, yet here he was, confronted not by chaos, but by reasoned resistance. The women were not asking for permission to exist as people, they were asserting it. Outside the room, the plantation slept, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. Inside, time seemed suspended. The women did not know how he would respond, only that whatever happened next would define what followed. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Fear was there, yes, but it was tempered by a strange clarity. For once, they were not reacting, they were acting. The son eventually dismissed them, not with threats, but with visible uncertainty. He told them to return to their quarters, that he would consider what had been said. It was not a victory in any obvious sense. Nothing had been granted, nothing guaranteed. Yet as the women walked back together, something had changed. They had stood their ground and survived the moment. That alone felt monumental. By morning, rumors moved through the household, subtle but persistent. Servants noticed the tension, the W.A. The son moved through the house differently, distracted, unsettled. The women returned to their tasks, outwardly unchanged, but beneath the routine their resolve remained firm. They had tested the boundaries and discovered that they were not as immovable as they had been taught to believe. The act of defiance did not dismantle the system overnight. It was never meant to. Its power lay in what it revealed, that obedience was not inevitable, that unity could disrupt even the most entrenched authority. The women understood that consequences would come, perhaps not immediately, perhaps in ways they could not yet foresee. Still, they did not regret what they had done. Regret belonged to a life lived entirely on someone else's terms. From that night on, the house carried a quiet tension that could not be smoothed away. The son could enforce rules, issue commands, remind himself of his position, but he could not forget the image of 5 women sitting calmly where they were never meant to sit, speaking as if their voices mattered. The illusion of absolute control had been broken not by force but by presence. For the women, the act became a point of reference, a line dividing what had been from what now was. They knew the path ahead would not be easy, but they also knew something essential had been reclaimed. They had named themselves, if only for a moment, in a world determined to deny them that right. And once named, they could not be erased quite so easily. The days that followed did not explode into chaos the way stories often suggest they should. Instead, change crept in quietly, unevenly, carried on the backs of ordinary routines that now felt slightly off balance. The plantation woke each morning as it always had, bells ringing, work beginning, voices calling orders across fields and corridors. Yet beneath that familiar surface something had shifted, and Evrio sensed it, even if few could name it. The house no longer felt entirely certain of itself. Doors closed a little more carefully. Conversations paused when footsteps approached. Authority, once so confident in its own permanence, now moved with hesitation. The son tried at first to restore normalcy through distance. He reduced his appearances in the house, relying more heavily on overseers and written instructions. This retreat was not mercy, nor was it strategy in any calculated sense. It was confusion. He had expected obedience to reassert itself once the moment passed, expected fear to erase memory. Instead, the memory lingered, refusing to settle. Each time he considered punishing one of the women, he hesitated, not because he doubted his right, but because he doubted the outcome. Punishment, he realized, would not return him to the certainty he had lost. It would only confirm that certainty was gone. The women noticed the change immediately. They moved through their tasks with the same care as before, but their awareness sharpened. They listened not just for commands, but for what was left unsaid. The house felt tense, as if holding its breath. No direct retaliation came, and that absence was unsettling in its own way. They knew the system well enough to understand that silence could be a prelude to something worse. Yet days passed, then weeks, and still nothing overt happened. The uncertainty became its own burden, a reminder that consequences did not always arrive quickly or clearly. Rumors traveled faster than orders. House staff whispered to field hands whispered to neighboring plantations. The story changed with each telling, shaped by fear and fascination. Some said the women had threatened violence, others claimed they had demanded freedom outright. The truth mattered less than the fact that a story existed at all. In a world built on the illusion that control was absolute, even a distorted rumor of resistance was dangerous. The plantation owner heard fragments of it during a visit, comments that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. He sensed something amiss, but dismissed it as exaggeration, unwilling to believe that the system he had trusted his whole life could be unsettled so quietly. When he finally confronted his son, the conversation was strained. The father spoke of discipline and reputation, of the importance of reminding people of their place. The son listened, but the words landed differently now. He had seen what happened when people refused to perform their assigned roles, and he could not unsee it. He offered reassurances without conviction, promising to handle the situation to restore order. The father accepted these assurances because accepting them was easier than questioning his own assumptions. Neither of them acknowledged how fragile their certainty had become. For the women, life did not become easier. The work remained demanding, the surveillance constant. Yet something fundamental had changed in how they experienced those conditions. They no longer moved through the days believing entirely in the inevitability of their suffering. The act they had committed together had carved a small space inside them, a place where agency lived. That space did not protect them from harm, but it protected something equally important, the belief that they were more than what had been decided for them. Their bond deepened under pressure. They checked on one another constantly, reading signs of exhaustion or fear with practiced ease. When one faltered, the others adjusted without comment. There was no celebration of what they had done, no sense of triumph. Instead, there was responsibility. Having acted together, they understood that they would face whatever came next together as well. That understanding carried weight, grounding them in a reality where individual survival had been replaced by collective endurance. The house responded in subtle ways. Rules were clarified, then clarified again, as if repetition might restore their authority. New procedures were introduced. Small changes meant to assert control without drawing attention to why such assertion felt necessary. Yet these efforts only highlighted the shift. Order enforced too carefully revealed its own anxiety. The women followed the rules as required, but they no longer mistook them for truth. They saw them now as tools, imperfect and dependent on belief. Outside the house, the plantation's rhythm continued, but the ripple spread. Other enslaved people noticed the women's quiet confidence, the way they stood a little straighter, spoke a little more deliberately. Nothing overt was said, but presence alone communicated possibility. Not hope in the grand sense, but awareness. Awareness that the system relied as much on silence as it did on force. Awareness that silence could be broken. The son felt increasingly isolated. Authority had once given him identity. Now it felt like a role he was struggling to play convincingly. He watched the women from a distance, trying to understand what he had lost. It was not control in the practical sense, the work still got done, but something more intangible. He had lost the certainty that obedience was natural. In its place was the uncomfortable knowledge that obedience could be withdrawn, even if only in small, costly ways. Time moved forward, indifferent to tension. Seasons shifted, altering the light and the air. With each passing month, the story of what had happened became less immediate but no less significant. It settled into the plantation's collective memory, shaping behavior in ways no one could fully predict. The women did not know whether their act would lead to further opportunities or harsher restrictions. They knew only that they would not return to the unthinking compliance of before. That door had closed. The consequences were not evenly distributed. One of the women was reassigned to harder labor for a time, a punishment disguised as necessity. Another was denied small privileges she had previously been granted. These measures were calculated to avoid drawing attention, to discourage without provoking. The women endured them, absorbing the cost together. Each consequence confirmed what they already knew: resistance was never free. But it also confirmed something else, that the system feared them enough to respond carefully. As years passed, the plantation owner grew older, his confidence calcifying into habit. He never fully grasped what had happened under his roof, only that something had unsettled his household and then faded from view. He told himself the issue had been resolved. In a narrow sense, he was right. The plantation still stood, the hierarchy still functioned. Yet the resolution he imagined was incomplete. What had been altered could not be restored simply by waiting. The women carried the memory forward, even as circumstances changed. Some were eventually sold, others transferred, their paths diverging. Yet wherever they went, the bond they had formed left its mark. They recognized one another's strength in others, sensed when silence masked something more. The act they had taken together became a reference point, a reminder that even within the tightest constraints, choice could exist, however limited and costly. The plantation itself faded into history, its records listing transactions and yields, but not moments like this one. Official accounts would never mention 5 women sitting calmly in a forbidden space, speaking as if their voices mattered. But history lives not only in ledgers and documents, it lives in what people carry with them, in the lessons passed quietly from one life to another. The shock that followed the owner's gift did not come from rebellion or violence. It came from exposure, from revealing that power depended on belief, and belief could fracture. In the end, what changed everything was not a single outcome, but a shift in understanding. The women learned that unity could unsettle even the most rigid structures. The son learned that authority without consent was more fragile than he had been taught. And the plantation, for all its efforts to present itself as eternal, learned something it could never fully forget: that control was not as complete as it claimed to be, and that those it sought to reduce to property remained stubbornly and irrevocably human.